Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Keeley. I'm the Executive Director of the Ivey Academy, the Learning and Development wing of Ivey Business School in London. I'm here broadcasting live again this week from Paris, Ontario. Thanks for taking the time out of your day today. We really hope you get some value here. One of the three guiding principles, the first one actually that we're using right now, is to try to be as helpful as possible. So that's the school, our clients, the broader market, the community that we serve, and to try to really do it in a humble way. As a business school, we know we're not on the front lines of this like our healthcare workers are. I was actually exchanging some emails this morning with a doc that we do some work with. That's Dr. Kathy Faulds here in London, and her stories are both just awful and also inspiring. Obviously, it's a tough and turbulent time, a bit scary time for everyone, including business leaders and decision makers. The numbers this week are kind of all over the place. We have Professor Tony Frost with us today to help make some sense of the data and to frame up some strategies we really hope can help in the face of uncertainty. Let's start with introducing the team that will be with you today. I'm going to act as the host and a bit of a traffic cop. We also have Sean. Sean, say hello, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mark.
Sean's going to be our tech lead, and more importantly, he'll be keeping track of and curating questions that we see in the chat and in the Q&A. Sean and I are going to come in with some themes that emerge from everyone listening and engaging. But the star of our show today, of course, is Tony. Tony Frost is a professor of business strategy and economics. Tony received his PhD from MIT's Sloan School of Management, and before earning his PhD, Tony was in the MBA at Sloan and spent some time at Microsoft in Redmond. Tony spent 25 years at Ivey as one of the most acclaimed teachers we have at the school. His specialty really is at the intersection of the macro environment and strategy, with deep expertise in strategy and competition in a global context. He's an executive education faculty director here with us at the Academy. He's done a ton of work with our global client base in the last 10 years, everything from C-suite teams in insurance to food to energy, retail, on transformations and on pivots. So Tony, can you say hello, please?
Hi, everybody. Great to be here with you. I obviously wish we were here under happier circumstances, but super glad that we could connect. If I could just do a quick shout out to the hundreds, and maybe we're going to be even over 1,000 at some point, of former students and participants in our executive programs that I've had the pleasure of working with and teaching over the years. So great to be here with you, even in these trying times. And of course, like Mark, a big shout out to our frontline workers in this crisis in the healthcare, and your courage and the stories that are coming out of there are truly inspiring.
Okay, so there you go, folks. We already have our first takeaway, which is, at least here at the Academy, if you want to get ahead, you have to shave your head. Sean, I'm not saying, I'm just saying.
That's right.
If you tuned in last week to our session with Kanina, you know that we're going to try to be quite interactive here, even with a relatively large audience. We think we've got more than 1,500 folks online with us right now. We're going to keep the pace pretty brisk. So we'll be doing this session in three sections, just roughly a macro look, a linkages look, and then how do we respond and what do we do look. Those will be the three areas we cover today. Before we kick off, Sean, let's just go over to you for some notes on how this is really going to work. Sean, can you get into that, please?
Sure. So as Mark and Tony both mentioned, we have a great turnout today, and we'll do our best to bring in questions from the audience. You can send questions by clicking the Q&A icon in the bottom of your window here. You can also help us curate the most popular submissions by upvoting, clicking the little thumbs up icon next to questions you like. Any questions we don't get to today, we are creating a Twitter thread at Ivey Academy where Tony will continue the conversation. Second, we've enabled some community polls today, and we'll be asking for your input live. So if you're tuned in through Zoom, you'll see a question pop up when we trigger each poll. If you're only dialed into audio via the phone number, you won't see that. So consider switching to a computer if you want to jump in. Your poll answers are completely anonymous. Welcome also to everyone tuned in on the live stream. The full recording of this broadcast will be posted on the Ivey Academy blog and YouTube. Everyone registered today will also get an emailed link with the slides and poll results as well. So thank you again for joining us, and back to you, Mark.
Okay, fantastic. Let's get going. Tony, let's start by framing the conversation we're going to have as a starting point. Could you talk a bit about what's happening right now as it relates to the work you do at Ivey, and then give us a quick snapshot of the macro situation, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, the work I do at Ivey, especially on the executive education side, is really about helping business leaders and not just top of the house, but folks in the middle too, to bring kind of an always-on strategic perspective to their roles and jobs. And so we've been, Mark, you and I, of course, have been out there working with companies for a better part of a decade on doing exactly this. A lot of what, of course, building a strategic perspective is about is having a curated external view. The mantra, and many of my students will have heard me say this, is, you need to have your eyes above the desk line or eyes above the horizon line even, and understand how those sort of big forces play out for industries and firms where you operate. And so, we've been doing, as you know, a lot of work in digital transformation and disruption dynamics and how AI big data is going to change strategies going forward. A lot of that stuff. And macro variables as well. So COVID-19 is just, it's a totally different kind of entity, isn't it? And yet similarities in the sense of now we've got this big external shock. How do business leaders and companies position themselves and respond appropriately? So in some sense it's the same, and in some sense it's a totally different world, right?
It's a bit hard to know what's happening and what's going on. Forecasts are all over the place. Comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big features here is the fundamental uncertainty about the depth and duration of the impact, isn't it? And I'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe I'll just give kind of a quick run through on sort of the macro picture as I see it. But that's going to be the theme, really, is uncertainty and around depth and duration. I'll also put out, I might say this a couple of times, is that the main thing right now is not so much the depth, although as horrible as it is on many dimensions, economic activity, unemployment, stock markets, et cetera, but the duration. How long is this going to last? I think is the huge dynamic. And of course, that's the interplay of the virus dynamic, the lockdown strategies, and the economy. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Just quick macro snapshot. It's hard to believe that just over 2 months ago, what was it, kind of late January, mid-January, we started to hear this, these rumblings and these stories coming out of Wuhan, which most of us didn't even know where that was, about this virus. And in its original kind of impact on us over here in Canada and North American markets was really on the supply side. And you remember those sort of stories which seem, I have to say, kind of quaint now about, will National League hockey players have enough hockey sticks to last the season? Now we kind of roll our eyes when we hear that because, of course, the virus spread. We have been whacked with the mother of all demand shocks. And that is partly, of course, because people are scared or don't want to go out, and they're being told not to do that. And we're closing down through various phases of lockdown, essential industries, shelter in place, and so on, which is just fundamentally closing off the web of economic activity that we normally governs our lives. So the steepness of the decline has been stunning, and I feel like I'm going to use the word unprecedented a little too often here, and apologize for that, but it has been unprecedented. Steepest decline in markets, which are not the economy, but steepest decline in real economic activity, biggest spike in unemployment. Take Canada, take the US numbers that just came out, in really one wants to say the history of capitalism, certainly the last 100 years, including even the Great Depression. So, that's kind of a sort of a run through to where we are today, and still trying to figure things out. Got a couple more points, Mark, but let me pause there and see if there's anything you want me to kind of emphasize.
Yeah, I mean, you've already touched on history a couple of times. Is there a precedent here, or are there precedents that are meaningful that we can draw on?
Yeah, I've been actually polling, did a couple of webinars with some alumni groups and student groups and faculty last week, and I gave them a little poll, right? Okay, what's your best historical analog here? Is it GFC, 2008-9, Great Recession, September 11th, World War II? 70% of them, by the way, said World War II. So, and there's definitely some analogs to that, but different. All of them are different. And if you take I think a point that worth highlighting here, if you take the global financial crisis, which was what most people's number 2 choice, remember that started really as a financial system shock, as a financial crisis, even though it had its roots in real estate banking nexus, as a financial crisis that then impacted the real economy. So my metaphor was, the finance yacht crashed into the hapless real economy freighter. That's the GFC. This is not that. This is actually more September 11th in that sense. It's more of an exogenous shock, an external shock that's impacted most immediately the real economy. That's where you and I work. And then, of course, it's flipped over and impacted financial markets in a dramatic way. And so the concern there, too, is that financial markets then feed back into the real economy through credit tightening and liquidity problems, through confidence effects and wealth effects. So now real economy impacting financial system and then flipping back into and impacting the real economy. So we are caught up, I'll just summarize by saying we're caught up in what we have seen in history before, which is these kind of where an economy works well, it's got virtuous cycles built into it. When they don't work well, they have vicious cycles. And so now we've got this situation of firms, struggling with sales in many industries, laying off workers. I mean, the Air Canada numbers, 15,000 the other day, and our million new job claims in Canada. Stressed consumers then not buying even more, but because they are nervous, but also they can't because of the lockdown. And around we go, from firms to consumers, firms to households. And that's the negative sort of doom loop we're in right now in the economy. So scary times.
And so enter stage right government. What about the response that we've seen so far? Also unprecedented in your view?
Yeah, there I think your war analogies are probably best. And I think I have a slide here that I might share a little bit to talk about budget deficits in history. And the one that obviously comes to mind is actually World War II.
Yeah.
For sure. But Leviathan, government to the rescue. I was reprising a little phrase that Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman, made in 2008, and he said, there's no atheists in foxholes and no libertarians in a financial crisis. And I think what we're seeing here is no libertarians in a pandemic either. So yeah, government to the rescue. And of course, when we talk about government to the rescue, really we're talking about 2 main arms here. We're talking about central bank monetary policy. And I think everybody's kind of seen what's happened there. Dramatic, coordinated drops in official interest rates. Canada twice, down to 0.25% today or now. And the weighted average official interest rate across the G7, so weighted by economy size, is, wait for it, 0. So the question people are asking is, are central banks out of ammo here? And no, they're not. And you've seen a lot of other actions, particularly around loosening up and alleviating credit market tightness and liquidity problems. The key thing here is not to let liquidity problems for companies that are, otherwise healthy turn into solvency problems where you get bankruptcies, you get the web of worker or employee and customer relationships collapsing and peeling apart. Those are really hard to put back together again. And so you just don't want to let that happen. So monetary policy has been, firing the bazooka and any other kind of, take your armament metaphor, cannon and so on, to do lots of unconventional stuff. We're all, folks, in a quantitative easing world now. Even Canada will be engaging in a lot of asset purchases by the central bank to try to stem the flow.
Just watching the Q&A here, obviously lots of questions coming in, a fair number of them on government and the response. So maybe you could sort of bridge the thought you just were in with, what do you think of the Canadian government response so far, maybe beyond Canada, and then how does it relate to fiscal and where does that go?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the other half of the official response, of course, is on the fiscal side, and I think most economists believe that the fiscal side is the one that's going to be to the rescue. Interest rates were already super low, right? And then now they're just parked at 0. So there's going to be a lot of things the central bank can still do, but fiscal policy to the rescue. And here I would again emphasize both the magnitude and the speed at which policies have been rolled out. And it's almost hard to keep track. I mean, every day there's sort of an update. It's small firms are going to get support. Now it's any firm that's got, impacted sales from the coronavirus problem. We're mailing checks to individuals, sort of now we're in a world of universal basic income. And so lots of support. I mean, Mark, and just to put this in perspective, think about this. If you and I had been able to get Vegas odds, a month ago on Germany willingly and with broad support within the country, launching a spending package that will create 10% of GDP of new debt. I mean, what are the odds? What would have been the odds of that? It's just unbelievable. Suffice to say, if we could have gotten those odds, you and I wouldn't be running webinars for a living. But
yeah, we might actually survive this thing if we.
That's right.
Odds. How long can governments keep this up, Tony?
Well, we don't really know. The problem, of course, is governments in the best of times are somewhere around, depends on the country, but 15 to 25% of GDP, and now they're being asked to lift, in some ways, the 2/3 that is normally consumers driving spending. So that's a huge lift. And again, that's why depth doesn't matter as much as duration. So it's going to be very hard to kind of keep that going. But virtually every government and central bank have adopted what's become kind of the Mario Draghi mantra. Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, of whatever it takes. And now I think we're kind of whatever it takes, however long it takes. So we're going to try that. I'll just highlight one last thing, Mark, and I know we want to move to the micro piece and what's going on in firms and industries, but you're going to be hearing a lot about governments and central banks really working together to make this happen. And this is, the brave new world we're in. We are running an experiment that will become, I think, colloquially known as helicopter money. You may have heard this word already, helicopter drop. And there, the idea is government spending. How do you finance that? Answer: central bank printing new money. So this is literally printing money to create funds to support, in the first wave, to support the health and wellness of people, survivability of businesses. And then I fully suspect we're going to see follow-on programs that are going to be more stimulus. Like, I don't even think this is stimulus yet. This is just, survive kind of spending. And so stimulus will come later. And so the legacy will be a giant amount of debt. And, that creates issues. But right now it's like, save the patient. We'll worry about the debt later.
Just one, I do want to transition, but I'm looking at the Q&A window, and there's more questions coming in here we can possibly answer today. Just a note to the audience, we will, as a follow-up, try to do a kind of a written summary of most of the questions that have come in. We'll probably do that through some sort of Twitter feed, but if we don't get to your question today, we will try to do it as a follow-up. So just before we transition, just lots of the questions here, Tony, are about kind of the rebound, right? Is there any chance of, from a government standpoint, is there any chance of getting out of this, paying this debt back? So, but before we transition, just any views on that?
Well, getting out of this and paying the debt back are somewhat different stories, right? Getting out of this, folks, fundamentally depends on defeating this virus. So getting out of it, and the sooner we do that, the less pain we're going to have later. So, I think lots of people have been advocating sharp increase, much more kind of universal in Canada, but also in the US, kind of approaches to this to really shut this thing down, curb the spread, so that it doesn't sort of carry on in a uncertain and popping up here and there for a long period of time. So that's key. Get this thing planked is the term that I think we've all been now we know what that is. So there you go. So getting out of the debt, that's a longer term kind of process, and it's going to take a long time. And again, maybe Sean, I've got a few slides that I know we're going to share. I'll just pop up the one here on debts and deficits in Canadian history. And this kind of will give you a sense of the probably correct analog or analogy here is going to be World War II. That's the kind of deficit spending we're going to see. And those deficits and debts can last a long time. And there's ways to get out of them. One of them is grow your denominator, grow your GDP, so the debt to GDP ratio comes down. Taxes, of course, are a possibility. And then the one that I think is interesting for people, and I don't think our subject today, but down the road, I think is a very important point is, is future, are we gonna shift paradigms into at some point an inflationary future, because that historically is how governments have solved debt problems. They've kind of inflated them away. And that, of course, creates lots of positioning around what to do with your savings and so on. But this isn't a fine personal, and so maybe we'll shift to the more firm level stuff, Mark.
Yeah, so let's do that. Let's talk about how this is playing out at the level of business. We'll go down to that level. I think you call this macro micro linkages. Can you give us a sense of how to think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it should be pretty clear that as a starting point, that different businesses are impacted in fundamentally different ways. Like no duh, right? So if you're Zoom, you're having a moment. If you're Princess Cruises, you're not. So that's fairly obvious. What I hear from our alumni and calls I've been getting is how do I kind of think about how all this big macro force is going to impact my firm? What are the different sort of levers or channels and so on? And in fact, built a little framework over the that came out of the GFC and the Great Recession that is meant to sort of help business people there kind of make sure they're not missing anything. This is sort of more of I guess, a checklist, if you will. So all the action right now for most companies is kind of on that demand side, isn't it? So the demand channel, big time impact, depending, again, if you're, if you're Loblaw versus cinema, it's going to be quite different. But demand channel, and so overall demand levels, different kind of niches and so on, that are kind of a key element of the way that these macro shocks, of course, play out at the micro level. I started with the supply side, and again, I think the supply side, the supply channel issues and the supply shocks have not gone away. They've just been dwarfed for most companies on the demand side. But as we start to talk, as we will a little bit later, about how companies are going to kind of get back to normal operations, then the issues are going to flip over also, I think, importantly, to supply side. Do you still have a supply base? How many of them have been kind of knocked out by this? Yeah. Cost, availability, quality, all that kind of stuff. So those are the main two that I think people focus on. But just very quickly, because I think the framework's fairly intuitive, it's meant to be more of a checklist, is that a couple other channels that I think are important here. Finance channel, of course, cost and availability of credit, things like accounts receivable, which I know lots of firms are kind of worried about, for sure, is another channel. And then sort of forgotten sometimes is that FX can play a big role, helping or hurting. So if you think about, just as a simple case study, Ford Motor, it's just, if you go around the board here, it's just being completely slammed by all of these things, right? Demand has completely fallen off. The supply side impacts are going to be, once they get tooled back up, are going to be important to help them manage. They were just downgraded in their debt, and I think I saw they're now into junk bond status. Yeah. And with interest rate yield on their debt somewhere around, I think I saw 9% or something like that. So that's going to be a huge problem. And then, what happens when crises happen, we enter a risk-on world, is oftentimes bond investors and others flood into safe haven currencies, causing appreciation of currencies like the dollar, the Swiss franc, and the yen. And Ford has to compete with companies, and so an elevated exchange rate can hurt it as well. So those are my four main channels. I got one more, Mark. I'll just pause there and see if there's anything you want me to address.
I think I want to keep moving. Balcony view of the economy. Who's going to make it out of this, and who isn't?
Yeah, for sure. Let's go there. I'll just very quickly. I really think back to this the point we were making before about the role of government here. I put another box in the middle here of government channels. So this is where I think we're obviously seeing government policies in place, different rules and regulations that are going to be imposed. Some are helping, some are of course constraining companies, and expectations around citizenship and responsibility are looming large here too. So government is going to be kind of influencing all of these different sort of core business channels as well, and important for companies and leaders and companies to kind of keep these in mind. So that's fairly, kind of checklisty, if you will, but just want to make sure that our viewers kind of have at least some way of saying, am I seeing all the ways that this could play out for me?
Yeah,
So,
I think that's so important. I mean, so much of the commentary I think I'm reading is really on the demand side and is ignoring some of these other factors. Particularly think about government. I can't imagine how we don't end up with much larger government after this is all said and done.
I think that's absolutely clear. It's going to be, but at this point, I think even people who have been more on the small government is good side are thankful that we've got both the authority, the capacity to mobilize and eventually perhaps even through kind of reserve and military and so on
Yeah.
resource, and the balance sheet, fundamentally the balance sheet. Big government turns out to be the only one that can fund this kind of deficit particularly. All right, so do you want us to move to talking a little bit about who's going to make it out of here? How do we think about that? And then we'll talk about strategies.
Yeah, 100% I do. And again, a note to the audience, there's a ton of questions here. Sorry, we're not getting to all of them. I hope we're picking up quite a few of them through the themes. And for anybody asking for slideshow mode, technically hard to do, but we will share the slides when we're finished.
Very good. Okay. So question I've been getting a lot of, asked a lot is who's going to make it out of this, and how do we think about that? And some of that sort of where are the good investments, Tony, kind of thing, which is not what the purpose of this is, but nonetheless it's worthwhile thinking about. I've just built a very simple framework that I think you might want to just think through here, and I've got a kind of a case study, if you will, of the music industry to show a couple of things that I want to kind of illustrate here. So the sort of core way to think about this is relates to your business model, right? And this is where there's some kind of conventional stuff around in times of economic downturns. We tend to see companies that are more staples, non-discretionary. So like toilet paper, kind of booming right now. It turns out.
Yeah.
Low to moderate cash outlays and so on. But critically, to what extent is the business either digital or digitizable, or at least contactless in terms of purchase, fulfillment, delivery, and so on. And the point here of using one industry is to show you that even within industries, the story is dramatically different. And I'll get to my y-axis in a minute. But if you think of Apple and Spotify, I mean, already basically purely digital businesses. Even Apple's headphone business is certainly e-commerceable. So
E-commerce, yeah.
So it's going to be, the business model resilience is pretty high. And one of the things that we learned from the last big downturn in the GFC was that, in fact, the last thing people cut was their cell phones and things like, wasn't such a big deal then, but music streaming. So although I did see a report the other day that music streaming was down a little bit, maybe like 5-6% year over year. And the story there was because people are so gripped by the news, they've sort of pivoted over to watching, CBC, CNN, reading Globe and Mail, and other kind of things. So we'll see where that goes. But by and large, those are fairly resilient businesses for all those reasons there on the x-axis. And on the y-axis is really a story about financial resilience, isn't it? Companies that have strong balance sheets, lots of cash, access to credit or credit lines. We're seeing those being tapped in kind of dramatic fashion. And or a corporate parent to shelter. So think about the left-hand side of this matrix here, and this is basically the live music side of the music world, and what a complete disaster. So the two examples I've got here: the poor symphony orchestras. Why are symphony orchestras the ones that always get slammed in these kind of events? It seems to be true, right? But now they're even worse than before, where perhaps people wanted to go out in the in the GFC and the downturn to go out and get a little comfort from symphony music. Now you can't even do that, and of course their business model depends a lot on donations, so they're completely going to be in super big trouble, and I fear for them. And then on the top left we've got kind of live music. So Coachella, the world's largest live concert, canceled or at least postponed, and so on. But they have a sheltering parent, one of the world's richest people, or U.S. richest people, owns that, so they're going to be okay. But so, that's kind of a simple way to think about it. Business model resilience, financial resilience, companies are going to vary on here. And so some of these down in that bottom left, especially are going to be seeking help in a pretty big way. Mark, I think we're talking about maybe we've got over 1,000 people on the line here, which is fantastic. Polling our audience on where is your business today on this matrix. Are we gonna roll that out here and show a little bit of our interactivity, some of our Zoom tools?
Yeah, and I think it'd be super interesting to get a bit of a pulse of the market of where we think everyone sits, and even as a percentage, what percentage of the market is in pretty good shape and really hurting and somewhere in between. I think we should do that.
Good. Okay. Well, Sean, I think's got a poll for you there, and I've just to make it try to put a little levity in the proceedings, because this is dark times, folks. I've pulled up some music themes here to consistent with what I did before. So the question we're asking in this poll is: are you ABBA Dancing Queen on the top right, or are you down in the Police King of Pain in quadrant 1? And then, or are you sort of Gloria Gaynor there, where your business model has been completely whacked, but you may have the resilience to survive for one reason or another, cash reserves, access to credit, or a sheltering parent. So that's the I will survive box. And then I don't think Sean, I think this is your music that we did down here in business model okay, but a little bit nervous because not very financially resilient. So this is searching for a gold digger. Is that that's I think that's you.
Oh, Sean, you're not going to take that, are you, Sean? You're not going to take that.
Let's go ahead and launch the poll and see where our
can you hold some hands here, Sean? Explain exactly what's going to happen next and how this is going to work, please.
Absolutely. So we're about to launch a poll. You'll select one of 4 answers to tell us which quadrant you think your business falls in, and we'll go ahead and launch that now. We'll run it for about 30 seconds. Tons of responses coming in so far. A lot of quadrant 4.
That's great.
Quadrant 3. Yeah, that's encouraging. We'll give another couple seconds for everyone to submit their votes. Okay.
It's a pretty good sample at 560.
So now we'll share the results.
Good.
So quadrant 4 was actually our winner at 39%. Next, quadrant 3 at 32%.
Well, that's I think happy news, right? So we either conclude that people companies are doing okay, making lemonade out of lemons, or our Ivey grads are well positioned in companies that are doing okay. So
I think that's the takeaway.
Yeah, I do feel this is one of better lucky than good kind of thing. It just kind of happens. But we're going to talk a little bit on how companies can respond and, of course, scramble in these uncertain times too. So it's not all about luck; it's about what you do. Good, Sean. And everybody can see that poll, I think, right?
That's right, but we'll also include it with the materials that we send out after the webinar.
Excellent.
Hey, Tony, just as we bridge into the next session, a question that came in the chat here in the Q&A was, to what extent the frame holds for the recovery period?
Well, I don't see a big reason why it wouldn't, other than financial resilience and sheltering parent maybe becomes a little bit less important. But where we're going with this, I think, is the extent to which organizations can think about that digital or digitizable delivery and fulfillment. Now, symphony orchestra is pretty tough to do, right? But Mark, even in our own work that we do with corporates, and we were joking, not really joking, but we're basically a cruise ship without water, and we put people together for a week at a time and do intensive education programs. that's a terrible place to be. There's almost no worse place to be. But thinking about pivoting into online delivery and so on. So really, I think the next phase becomes one of adaptation. And to what extent can you kind of reinvent yourself if you're down in those quadrants that are stressed?
Yeah, I mean, and even us, right? We're thinking about how do we become like a kind of a broadcaster in a way, and I wonder if other businesses could think about that, even at Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah, well, some can and some can't, right? It's just pretty clear. But there may even be aspects of the business that you can. Think about car dealerships or cars are going to be, perhaps sold in a different way, right? And they're big trouble today. But maybe this is pulling forward the already initiatives that were underway in terms of moving to digital, moving to online, omni-channel kind of stuff that have been big trends over the last almost decade.
For sure. Okay, let's go even more micro. A lot of the folks we've got tuned in are in the position of decision makers. They're in the position of leader. They're trying to figure out what to do. So let's talk about some strategies for companies during this period. What should leaders be thinking? How should they be responding right now?
Yeah. Great. The main starting point I would have is that you really need to be thinking about periodizing your strategy. There's the now moment, and then there's future moment. Now, the future uncertain. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what you do right now is, of course, germane. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But I also want to make sure we talk a little bit about the go forward approach. And the story I'm going to really tell you is one of, I think, what companies need to be doing is a lot of alternative scenario modeling for how the interplay of virus, lockdowns or containment strategies and economy are going to kind of work out. So I'm just going to share one more slide with you, and then I think we've got another interactive poll, don't we, Sean, that we'll launch here. So let me pull this up. I'm resurrecting something certainly the students I've had in the last 10 years would remember, is a sort of an acronym that came out of the Great Recession. And if we start to think about, what do alternative recovery strategies look like, and we had this acronym of LOVE, L-U-V. So a scenario where we kind of go down and then we stay flatlined in a kind of low economic activity paradigm for a while. U-shaped recovery, or a V snapback. And what we saw in the GFC and Great Recession was, a range of different kind of outcomes for different countries, for sure, with China and emerging markets being more V, the more mature markets being U, think the US there and Europe, and then some countries that kind of flatline for extended period of time. So that's I'd like to kind of just use that as a fairly easy to understand tool to think about strategies. But I also want to add one here, which is I think really almost COVID specific. And for those of you who've been following, and haven't we all, the different graphs and scenarios around how this virus is going to play out, this idea of a sine wave recovery. And here I'm thinking about the Imperial College modeling that showed that a likely scenario is where we clamp down hard on the virus through social distancing and more extreme versions of that, shelter in place, and we make progress, and the curve comes back down, and then we say, okay, we've got to get the economy going again because we're tanking. You release some of those measures, economy starts to go again, and we outbreaks. And so we end up in this cycle of letting off measures, more outbreaks, clamping them back down. And we're already seeing this a little bit in Asia. I was just on the phone with a client in Singapore. They're cracking back down again after having a good job of containing the first wave, because people travelers are coming back in, and also just people are relaxing a little bit on their social distancing, and bump up goes the virus count again. So this is a sine wave recovery, very difficult to position for. I want to talk a little bit about that. But I think all the action today, isn't it, is in the really what you might call the I phase, where we're just dropping, and markets dropping, economy dropping off a cliff, And so what do you do in that period? So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then as we move towards the last 20 minutes or so, a little bit about recovery scenarios and so on. So if part of my value add as a teacher has always been to kind of try to take complex stuff and simplify it into things that people can remember. So this I love W one will hopefully be one you can kind of take away. I've been sort of joking that the W is like a roller coaster. So my phrase is I love woo, with the OO at the end. And so Mark, I love woo, and hopefully you can remember this scenario through that little algorithm.
I love woo too, Tony.
Sorry to be awkward on live TV. Good. So let's talk a little bit about the that first phase. What I'm hearing, talking to clients, and of course doing a lot of reading about what's going on, is that some key themes and priorities are really coming to the fore, and companies are approaching these quite differently. Again, that's a meta theme of our whole session, which is that some organizations, some businesses are going to be way more dramatically affected negatively than others, and some are even going to be in that kind of dancing queen cell. So bear that in mind. But this is where today what we're seeing a lot of is companies creating various names, nerve centers, control towers, SWAT teams, war rooms, whatever kind of metaphor you've got, and it really identifying some key priorities. I've got 8 listed here. And I feel, that what we're going to do is actually poll our group again, because it's good to get a little bit of a landscape view. But if you think about the ideas and themes and priorities we're seeing, health and safety, cash, communication, cost reduction around costs that are potentially eliminated quickly to help preserve the business. Good corporate citizenship as being a theme priority here, sort of CSR stuff. Of course, government relationships, maintenance and care of equipment and facilities, and then somehow, somewhere retaining sales for companies that aren't in the hand sanitizer business. So, Sean, I think we're gonna try to actually launch a poll. There's one right answer here, folks, but I think everybody would like to have a bit of a view of what are the top priorities you're seeing across businesses in this particular time. And I think it's pretty safe to say that health and safety is pretty much for everybody going to be the number one. I mean, how many emails have we all received from various suppliers and so on, here's all the things we're doing, which is absolutely appropriate and would be the first priority. So if we just sort of acknowledge that that's going to be the top priority, I would like to take the sort of 2 through 8 there, and if we could, ask our audience here today, in your organization, over and above health and safety, what are the top 3 priorities that you are seeing or you are being asked to really put to the fore here? Sean, are we ready to launch that poll?
Thanks, Tony. We are. So this poll is going to work a little bit differently. You're going to get 3 questions in sequential order. Just think about what your top 1, 2, and 3 business priorities are. It'll be the same question each time you're asked, just top, second, and third. So we'll launch that now for about 30 seconds. Some definite trends emerging.
Let's give people a little bit of extra time. I really want to get a good pulse here.
Yeah, we'll leave this one open for maybe another 30 seconds. We're getting, as the number 1 priority, unsurprisingly, cash and credit lines are important. Communication with key stakeholders, another very popular option, unsurprisingly. Second and third priorities get a little bit more diverse of a mix. I'm curious to look at the data, and in about another 10 seconds, we'll leave it open. Okay, so with about 550 responses, we'll close the poll.
Interesting.
And share the results in a second. So you can see on your screen, cash and credit lines was number 1 priority at 30%. Communication, a close second at 28%. Any thoughts on that so far, Tony?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'm also just interested in how low government relationships and maintenance of equipment are. That's kind of interesting. Heard that from a few, that care and maintenance of facilities was a big thing. So it's maybe just reflects our audience backgrounds here and the business portfolio we've got online here. But and sales retention, notice that's sort of down. Number 3 priority, so sales retention. I think certainly we see that companies scrambling to figure out what that means, and how quickly they can maybe convert their businesses into something that is contactless delivery and so on.
Yeah, I mean,
Easy to say.
let's see how it plays out with the second and third poll, right? Because this was just what is your number 1 priority.
Yeah, well, we've got actually all 3 on there, don't we, Sean, that we're seeing? Are you showing all 3 polls?
Yep. So you can scroll down to see number 2 business priority was communication and cost reduction. And then number 3, as you mentioned, Tony, was sales retention. That said, we are seeing a couple of notes in the chat. Melissa is noting that the poll didn't have growth as an option.
Growth.
So some people might be thinking that way as well, right? Instead of, what can I do to mitigate? What can I do to...
Very good. Well, that's I actually think that's a great segue, Mark, to our last little pasture here on what can you do in more of these alternative scenarios after, because remember, we're in this in this crisis mode here right now, but our best guess is this is going to be somewhere kind of peaking in, say, May, although we're hearing, of course, stories that some of the lockdowns will carry on into the summer and July, but at some point, and I really think it's worth bearing in mind here, is that, all of our history of our, this isn't the first pandemic we've had. We had lots of big shocks to the system before. This one is huge, but we'll get over it. And so I think the thing I would stress here is don't let the current crisis period be your only focus. You can't stop thinking about the future. And for business leaders and sort of the as you're thinking kind of strategically, you're going to have to manage the moment, but you're also going to have to kind of position yourself for where you want to be going forward. So yeah,
we talked yesterday offline, Tony, about one of the signs we thought we would probably see in a month or 2 or maybe 2.5 would be, it would be healthy if we saw nerve centers kind of closing. And, the scenario planning has moved into scenario implementation or acting in a new normal. And one of the potential outcomes there, to Melissa's point, was, maybe there is an offensive play here for some firms, or at least the opportunity for an offensive mentality. So can you just use that as kind of a general bridge to, so where do we go from here?
Yeah, agreed, for sure. Let's talk about that. I also think, Mark, just as we get out of the crisis period and as those control centers and nerve centers are kind of hopefully shut down, one of the dangers, I think, is that, and it's really something I think well anchored for those of you who have worked with me, with my colleague Martha Masnevsky. She always likes to point out that managers often like to find ways to be Hercules about everything. And this is not necessarily the management style that you want to kind of have, especially even now, but as we move forward, and that you need to also build in a little bit of not just being the kind of, the person in charge and doing all the grand leadership things, but also to empower, delegate, use the front lines to feed back information of what's going on. So she calls that kind of more Buddha leadership, if you will, of letting the team that you've built to room to breathe, recover, do the right things. And so, transitioning out of that crisis period into the future is really probably letting go some of those kind of key priorities that companies are really focusing on in the present time. Switching to the future. So here's what I guess the key thing is, what's your view? And here where I would say is, I think companies need to be planning for all of these scenarios. For a pattern in which the extended period of decline or shutdown, the deep freeze, if you will, carries on for a longer period of time. What does that look like for you? And then kind of U and V-shaped recoveries. I would say that, the baseline a couple of weeks ago is that we'd probably snap back fairly quickly, V-shaped recovery. I actually don't think that's the baseline view anymore. I feel like U-shaped recoveries are probably more And partly here's a bit of advice is, watch what's going on in China. So right now is a great time to get some of the real-time indicators. Financial Times posted every day on various activity, sources of activity in China and what's going on there. So I think that's a really critical feature. My mantra right now is I feel like we're taking an elevator down and we're going to kind of take an escalator back. And so that's more of a U-type recovery. And there, I think, again, businesses will differ in terms of what that looks like, but the ramp up of normal activity is something that, of course, needs to be planned for. And this is where some of the emergent problems that you really want to be thinking about and preparing for now are around supply chain and making sure that you've got the ability to handle the snapback in demand should it come. So I think that's key. Mark, you mentioned offense too, and I think this is one of the things I always tell my students is one of the hardest things to do as a leader in a company is to lead and act countercyclically. And in this, and the steeper the decline, the harder that is, right? To not necessarily do things like cut R&D, cut marketing spend, and so on in these moments, if you have, of course, the financial wherewithal to kind of make those calls. So there are going to be some amazing opportunities, and I'm not just talking about investment, but I'm talking about strategic opportunities. Companies that had been thinking about potentially, entering into adjacent businesses, moving different pieces of the vertical chain. This may be a great time to pick up assets that were probably overvalued pre-crisis, and now may be a fantastic opportunity to get in and make the moves that you wanted to make at a moment in time. So I do think that at some point, and certainly there should be groups in, especially if you're a large corporate, thinking about what does offense look like this? How can we use this crisis as a source of opportunity? And a lot of that activity will be probably on scope decisions. Where do we choose to play given alternative scenarios about the future? Acquisitions will be important in there, but even things like setting ourselves up for a future that looks different than today, particularly around digital, online kind of strategies. These seem to me to be the perfect kind of moment to be thinking about, can we accelerate our move in there that many companies, of course, have been working on for a long time. I think insurance here as being a great example of because I think one of the legacies out of this is going to be the decline in kind of face-to-face activity, at least for a while. So sorry, Mark, I'm kind of rambling on there. There's a lot to obviously cover. Any salient questions that come out?
Yeah, there are so many, but I thought one, or I'll read one that I think is kind of exemplary of a whole host of questions around early road signposts to know which of the paths that we're likely on, and then sources of data. So the question is, what sorts of early road signs would we want to look for to try to distinguish whether we're headed for L or U or V or W? That's from Justin Robinson. And then I would just add to that, what data sources are you going to, that you trust, presumably publicly available, that might help with sort of this question as well?
Yeah, well, first of all, it actually, for a lot of business leaders, it's going to take you into places where you're not experts. And what do I mean by that? Is that, you need to be watching, just as you watch your business signals and so on, you need to be watching also what the virus dynamics are, because I feel like that story is, going to be really paramount to what kind of a LUV, or as we'll talk about towards the end here, a W-shaped recovery. So you got to be watching that. There's lots of real-time stuff going on there. And then watching, kind of who's a little bit ahead of the curve on here. So right now, you're thinking about China, you're thinking about South Korea. What kind of, recovery are they seeing? Now, Canada is going to be importantly a little bit different. because our own caseload, which is of course absolutely critical to the health and livelihood of our people, but we're in this together with the world, right? Particularly in our neighbor to the south, where the dynamics look quite different. And so we may, bend the curve, plank the curve, or whatever through our actions. But if the rest of the world does not, given our exposure through many channels, but demand, commodity prices, and so on, we could be faced with good on health and not on economy. So I think you got to watch both the viral dynamics and kind of not just locally, but globally, and then looking for some of those early signals. And they're coming in all sorts of different weird ways, right? We're looking, people are monitoring satellite videos for pollution and kind of evidence of recovery and so on. So
highway traffic,
and coal plant emissions and so on. So you gotta look broadly, and I think that's absolutely key. So no definitive answer, but lots of kind of sense making right now and data collection is going to be kind of key.
So we won't hold you to it, but and we'll keep it to Canada. Any predictions, prognostications about what, say, September through to the end of the year looks like?
Well, so I'm going to stick with my story: elevator down, escalator back. I think it's not. I think it's going to be pretty ugly. All the way through 2020 is going to be. If we get back to positive growth in 2020, fantastic. But I think this is one of those things where the escalator is going to take 3 years before we get back to where we were before in terms of the economy. And that's you said you weren't going to ask me forecasting and prediction questions because right now it's just really hard to know. But there's my prognostication. Mark, maybe I know we're running really tight on time here, but I'll just flag that W recovery, W-shaped outcome here. I think this is going to be potentially the biggest challenge for companies. We have never had a paradigm before. We're literally within a month, months, not years. We're cycling on off, simmer, boil, and that's going to be something that I think companies should be really thinking about. How do we, bring everybody back to work, get going again, and then, work from home? How do we launch our normal face-to-face type business, and then we kind of push everybody back into digital, virtual, whatever? So I think this is going to be a huge challenge. I think I would say that I feel that companies, certainly this has been a big theme of our exec ed work, has been around, can we create, even with big corporates, more agile, flexible, adaptive, responsive structures? And now is the test, right? Can you do it? The good thing is, I think there's so much support and willingness for people to step out of the box, take some chances, do some new things. Look at us, we're doing, brave new world. We're doing webinars, online delivery, and that's pretty simple. But this on-off structure is going to be tough for companies, and I think they're, being leaders. This is where leadership and the ability to lead change and inspire people to do extraordinary things is going to be a critical success factor.
I know we talked a bit off air about the idea of rigid or nimble structures sort of in this dimension, but there's also kind of a time dimension. Could you imagine a bit of a phased recovery where you're having some folks go back to work on some days and not on other days, and so on and so forth? So you've got a time dimension to it to help with that nimbleness.
Yeah, well, even maybe more interestingly is if you start to parse out who those people are. And I think what we all of course hope for is there's going to be a vaccine down the road, and so, but there's also going to be partial herd immunity. It's still kind of a very much a evolving science on how long that lasts and so on, but we'll get tests for it. So one scenario is that it's different groups that actually come back and mobilize, and others stay more permanently, not permanently, but more longer term working from home, who haven't been exposed and who have maybe vulnerabilities and so on. So that's a crazy way to think about how our economy will be rejigged, but it's a scenario worth thinking about.
I know we're up against it on time, so I want to reiterate a couple of things. We will endeavor to answer 95 questions that came in through the Q&A, most of which we didn't get to. By the way, your friend Nick Bontis says hello, that I know a little bit too.
Very good.
Hello, Nick. And the recording of this will be available almost immediately. Is that right, Sean, in the slides?
That's right, and on YouTube.
Let's all thank Tony here. Tony, great job today. Thanks for making the time. Thanks for putting in all the effort to get to what we hope is an informed and helpful point of view for everyone out there. Maybe last word to you, Tony.
Yeah, good. Well, good luck, everybody. I guess is the most appropriate thing to say. I hope you're doing okay, first and foremost on health and safety. Hope this was a little bit helpful, and I'm sure we're going to be coming back with more for you to think about. Especially, one thing we didn't talk about is, when this is all over, what are the big tectonic changes that this generational moment that we're having will leave us with? Everything from consumer behavior to politics to how we think about globalization, I think are themes that are going to be emerging and super important. So, we'll hopefully engage those up later. But right now, survival, good luck in the crisis, and getting through this this horrible period. And wash your hands and stay 2 meters apart.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. For anyone still tuned in, there'll be an announcement later this week about what we're going to do next week, and we'll leave it there. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Cheers. Take care.
Thank you. All the best.